Okay, we're at the 1 o'clock mark and it looks like we've got quite a few people already in, so we are going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to say thank you everybody for joining. Appreciate you guys taking time out of your schedules to spend a little time learning about inventory metrics. Just a quick check before we move into the webinar. I want to make sure everybody can hear me. So if you can't hear me, then well, you're not going to get this message, but if you can hear me, could you just send in a chat message or something to let me know that the audio is coming through? Okay, looks like we've got green lights from several people, so we are good to go. Okay, so if you haven't attended before, and I know that there are quite a few people joining this time, we're at almost 100 people attending, so I'm very excited about that. This is part of our monthly webinar series. So we do these about every month to just share some knowledge about the industry. It's not going to be a demo of what CalcuQuote as a product does. It's really going to be about sharing some knowledge that we've picked up along the way about what EMS companies do. So before we get started with the meat of the webinar, though, what I'm going to do is do a quick introduction of the voice that you're hearing. My name is Chintan Sutaria, and I'm the founder and president of CalcuQuote. If you haven't heard of what CalcuQuote is before, we are a quoting solution. We have a software for the RFQ process specifically for EMS companies. So if you're doing PCB assembly, cable assembly, that kind of work, then what our software does is it handles the end-to-end RFQ process. That means everything from when the RFQ comes in the door to scrubbing the BOM, material costing, labor estimation, overhead, markup, and being able to track how you send that quote to the customer and whether you win or lose that business. So that's what CalcuQuote does. The reason we do these webinars is to be able to share some information about the EMS industry overall. We've gotten to see more than 100 EMS companies across North America, as well as several abroad that seems like they're facing similar challenges and have similar areas of interest. So this is a way of being able to share that. We've gotten to see how a lot of companies do it as well. So we get to see some of the best practices that are evolving. And so this is a good way to be able to, without giving away very specific information, being able to share what some of those best practices are. So with that, let's get into the topic for today, which is about inventory metrics. But first, I want to answer the question of why metrics. Why did we choose this topic? And the reason we chose this topic, it's really summarized well by this quote from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker basically says, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's something that we definitely believe in CalcuQuote, where we're measuring quite a bit of things, whether it's metrics related to internal processes or performance or anything like that. But it really applies at a broader scale to EMS companies as well. So a lot of EMS companies struggle with knowing how the performance of their business is going, other than being able to look at the cash balance at the end of the month. So metrics are extremely important in order to be able to sustain continuous improvement and things like that. The reason we chose inventory metrics in particular for today is because with inventory metrics, inventory represents a significant portion of any EMS company's activities. So they are, I'll say that they are very good at being able to manage inventory, but being able to measure that is quite a bit of a challenge. And inventory represents, sometimes 50+% of your total expenditure for the year as an EMS company. So if you think about an EMS company that's doing 20 million in revenue, they might very well be spending 10 to $15 million in just the inventory side of it. So that's why inventory metrics are such an important part. An introduction to metrics here is what we're going to look at next. And so what I want to do is just lay the groundwork for the metrics that we're going to talk about and give everybody a good sense of, I guess, the scope of this conversation. So the first thing here is that when we talk about metrics, it's always going to start with a strategy. Today, we're jumping forward a few steps and showing you some of the metrics out there that exist. But I would not recommend that you just pick all the metrics that sound cool. Instead, you want to start with a strategy for your business and figure out which levers you want to pull, where do you want to find your strategic differentiation before you start picking metrics. So it always starts with the strategy first. The second thing I would say is considering balance, which means that, in metrics or, in any business process decision, any business strategy decision, there's always a trade-off. And so you want to make sure that you're considering balance. If you start measuring one thing exclusive of other things, then what you're going to see is a big skew, a big shift towards only that one thing. And so what you want to do is make sure that you're finding balancing metrics that gives you the right balance between two or more different metrics. The third thing is that the data input is the data output. Another way of framing that is garbage in, garbage out. There's a lot of different ways that gets put into play, but basically what this means is that you need to have systems that accurately capture data for you to be able to use metrics, right? There's a saying of keeping it simple. That's absolutely true as well for metrics, which is that if you don't have data coming in, then you're not going to have any data coming out. But also, if it's hard to put data in, then it's going to be hard to get data out because people aren't going to do it. Which brings me to my next point here, which is that you have to consider the human element. There's this great quote from Charlie Munger, who's the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. He says, "Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome." And that's absolutely true for anything that's measured in an organization, especially in larger organizations where the human behavior starts to shift based on the metrics that they're being evaluated on as employees, right? So what you want to make sure that you do is you consider the human behavior that comes from the metrics that you create for yourself. The next thing is that metrics come into play at levels. So you don't want to just be looking at a particular level of a metric. So here's what I mean by that is that I've got 3 points here. The first one is that you'd have aggregating metrics. So think of that as point in time evaluations of how something is at this point, right? So an example of that would be, what is the current balance of inventory? Once you break out of a particular threshold that you've defined is when you want to get the alert. Otherwise, you're okay with it staying below that threshold. The second thing is trends. That tells you how those aggregated metrics have performed over time. And the insight you're going to get from that is whether you're getting better or worse over time. So how are policies, processes, strategic decisions you make impacting your metrics over time? An aggregate metric, a point in time metric is not going to tell you that information. And then the third point here is details, which can be used for investigation and correction. So if all you had was that your inventory balance is $3 million without knowing the details behind how that $3 million came together, it would be very difficult for you to have a significant impact on how to adjust that number or how to move that figure down or up depending on what your goals are. So I would say that you need to have the details, be able to drill down into the details after you look at the aggregate number and find a cause for investigation. As part of that investigation, I would say that it's very important that you don't ignore the anecdotal and the qualitative evidence. A lot of times numbers might be telling you one thing, but your experience and your anecdotal evidence that you're seeing tells you something else. Trust your gut there, trust the stories you're seeing in front of you, because it's very possible, going back to the previous point of data in, data out, that there could be some skewing of the metrics that you're seeing. So you want to consider that as part of your investigation as well. And then the final point here is that you want to make sure that you're setting goals and communicating those metrics out to your organization. So a metric by itself, that's only known to the CEO of the company doesn't do a whole lot of good. Instead, you want to communicate that down to every level of the organization and across to every vertical of the organization to let everybody know that this is what we're measuring, this is what's important to us, so that you can start to get some common behavior, common objectives throughout the organization. With that, we're going to move into talking about the dozen metrics that we've put together for today's presentation. And for each metric that we cover, we've put it into one of 4 different categories. And for each of those, we're going to talk about the definition of what that metric is. We're also going to talk about what's needed to be able to track that metric in terms of systems and things like that. And then we'll talk about other areas that are impacted by that metric. So you'll get to see a sense of the scope and relationships to other areas. And finally, we'll look at ways to improve that metric. So how do you want to influence that metric? And with that, I'm going to get started. The first category that we're going to look at is inventory accuracy. And with inventory accuracy, what we're looking for is a measurement of how reliable the inventory levels you have are according to the system that is your data source. So there's 3 metrics that we've identified here in order to measure reliability. The first one is the net value of the corrections. This means that if you're making corrections up or down, you want to net those out and see if your inventory value is moving in a particular direction or not. The second one is the absolute value of corrections. And this is different from the previous one in that if, let's say, on day 1, I lose $1 million worth of inventory, and on day 2, I find $1 million worth of inventory of different parts, the net value might be 0, but it's absolutely important for me to know in terms of there was $1 million shift for 24 hours, because how are we losing and finding $1 million worth of parts? So that's why the absolute value is also a very important metric to measure in this case, and it's a nice balancing metric. And then the third is the number of corrections that you're having to do. So if it's one large correction, that's very different than if you're constantly having to make adjustments to your inventory levels day in, day out, throughout the month or throughout the quarter or whatever time measurement you're using. So all 3 of those important. You can see over here to the right of that, we've got these bars that indicate low and high. Red basically means that that's out of range for, you want to have, for net value of corrections, for example, you want to have it closer to the middle, which is closer to 0, whereas for the other ones, you'd probably want it to be on the lower side as a good goal. The next thing I want to talk about here is what your system needs to be able to do. When I say system, a lot of people get intimidated by, well, we're not ready for a huge ERP implementation or something like that. I'll say that system can be a lot of different things, right? So for some people, a system is an MRP or an ERP system. For others, it's QuickBooks. There's a lot of different versions of QuickBooks out there that handle this type of stuff. Or it could even be an Access database or a spreadsheet, depending on the size of your organization. The point here is that you want to have something that's capturing information for you. And here are some points about what that system needs to be able to capture if you want to be able to track these metrics. So the first point here, it might seem a little obvious, is that you need to be able to associate costs to your inventory. So if I have a particular component, I want to be able to associate a cost to that component so that I can find out what the value of any correction I make is. The second point here is that I want to have a separate transaction type for inventory adjustments and corrections. What this means is that you don't want to treat it the same as, you don't want to treat adjustments and corrections the same as if you were issuing parts to a kit for production. Issuing parts to a kit for production is part of ordinary business. It's part of the manufacturing process, whereas an adjustment is something that you are correcting for. So those are 2 very different things. A parallel example of that would be if you're soldering a board. It's one thing to have to manually solder a board because that's part of the work instructions. It's another to have to take a part off the board and resolder it because the machine messed it up or something. So that's a good way to think of it, is you want to be able to distinguish the transaction type on those adjustments to the inventory. And then the third thing is that you want to keep a history of each correction. So if all you're doing is going in and overwriting the inventory quantity that you have or something like that, that's very hard to keep history. Instead, you want to keep track of the history so that you can group it by time. You can be able to see what the net value and the absolute value is, and also keep track of how many corrections there has been. Okay, next we're looking at inventory accuracy impacted areas. So the first one here is that by having inaccurate inventory, you're going to see impacts on the balance sheet just because the inventory line item on your balance sheet is going to be fluctuating, right? If I make an adjustment, using the previous example, if I find $1 million worth of inventory, my balance sheet is going to shift pretty heavily to show me that additional inventory. The second thing is that it'll affect profitability, because every time you find or lose inventory, it's also going to have some kind of impact on your profit and loss statement, whether it's to a variance account or to scrap account or something like that. But you want to make sure that you're recognizing that it's impacting both your profitability as well as your balance sheet. And then the third thing, and this goes to the core of what the manufacturing business does, is it's going to affect your on-time delivery and line shortages. The reason there is because if you're constantly making adjustments to your inventory, it becomes very difficult to be able to rely on your inventory. And so you end up with a higher probability of line shortages, a higher probability of outages, of not being able to meet customer forecasts and things like that. So you want to make sure that inventory accuracy is there for the other part of your business, which is the manufacturing part of your business. So ways you can improve inventory accuracy. The first one is to have better processes and controls for inventory handling. This goes, it's almost an obvious thing to say, but a lot of times what you'll see is that there are no processes or controls. People are just taking parts as they come in and putting them onto the board. And that's not going to work because there is no accounting for that part having come in. And so your inventory system starts to treat that as the part never came in. So you want to make sure that you have processes and controls to handle inventory throughout your organization. And then the second part of that is just having the process in writing is not going to be sufficient. Having the tools is not going to be sufficient. You also want to make sure that you've trained your employees and you're having them adhere to those processes. So, this manifests itself in a few different ways, but one of the most extreme examples of this I've seen is where people will have a locked inventory room, and in order to pull anything out of or put anything into that inventory room, you have to sign in and sign out for it and things like that. So you can go to that level extreme, or you can find something in the middle that works a little better for you, but you want to make sure that you're adhering to the processes for inventory control. The next part here is maintaining a single source of truth for inventory. So we see this sometimes where, you'll ask a CM how they're keeping track of their inventory, and the answer is, well, it depends, because for this customer, I keep it in a spreadsheet just because they like to keep it that way. For this other customer, I have it in my ERP system. And for this other customer, we set up a database in the 1990s that keeps track of that. That's not going to work because there's not a single source of truth. It's hard to keep track of where this inventory is coming from and where it's going. So very important to try to keep a single source of information for inventory. And then finally, if your starting point is that you want to establish inventory accuracy, there's two ways you can do that. The first thing I would say is that cycle counting is a nice preventative measure, and physical inventory is a good measure to be able to start and close your inventory process with. So for example, if I don't trust my inventory balance as it exists today, then a good starting position is to do the physical inventory and then do quarterly or monthly cycle counting to make sure that I'm just doing proper upkeep of my inventory accuracy. And that can also be part of the net value corrections that you're measuring so that you know if you're in fact performing accurately on inventory accuracy. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about inventory value. So this category of metrics is basically to come up with what is the value of your inventory. And I break that down into three different things here. I've got raw material inventory, WIP inventory, and finished goods inventory. And basically what this is going to tell me is that it's a point in time metric that tells me that here is the value of the inventory, but it also helps to view trends. So for example, if you can see that at the close of each month or at the close of each quarter, this is the inventory I'm seeing as compared to sales and things like that, it really helps you to be able to analyze the impact of policy and process changes that you're implementing. In order to be able to track this metric or these metrics, you need to be able to have an inventory system that can distinguish between raw materials, WIP, and finished goods. So that's very important. So if all of your components are kind of just sitting in one classification and you're not able to distinguish these three different categories, then it's very important that you find a way to do that. The second thing here is that we talked about this previously also, you want to be able to associate cost to your inventory. Again, this goes back to if you don't have some kind of cost field associated there, then it's hard to know how that correlates. The way this typically comes out is a lot of times we'll see customers that have their accounting is being done in QuickBooks and their inventory is being managed in some other MRP system or something like that, and the two don't reconcile. And so as a result, what ends up happening is that they don't actually have real values for the raw material, WIP, and finished goods until some kind of quarter end or year end audit. And then finally, you want to keep a historical record of that inventory value as well, just so you can track your progress. In terms of the areas impacted, There's a few things here. The first one is going to be the financial reporting, like always. But the important part of that I want to highlight is that the inventory value has a pretty significant impact on liquidity and working capital ratios. So if you're keeping track of your liquidity for cash flow reasons, or if you're keeping track of working capital ratios because you're that's a metric that's very important to you, then the inventory value is also going to become very important to you. Another thing to consider here is that if you have any kind of line of credit or something like that with the bank, then which category your inventory falls into, whether it's raw material, WIP, or finished goods, also matters for financial institutions. In terms of the next point here, bad debt risk, what this basically means is that the higher the amount of inventory you have, especially for WIP and finished goods, the higher the risk you're carrying for bad debt. So if a customer were to go bankrupt tomorrow or chose not to pay you, or there was some other kind of problem there, how much inventory have you already spent money on in order to be able to service that customer that will potentially no longer be paid for? So that's something to consider there. And then the other part of it, we already talked about in the previous category, but these inventory levels, if they get too low, then what it starts to impact is the on-time delivery and the line shortages. And on the other side, if they're too low, then you'll also see issues in terms of production flexibility and scalability, because you're not going to be able to adapt to a customer saying, can you ship me these boards a little early? Or I had a huge influx and my forecast is going up, so can you send me something? So that's also something to consider. Ways to improve these metrics. The first one is I want to, talk about a lot of times when we think of inventory value metrics, people think of the stockroom manager. Well, that's not necessarily a fair assessment, because what ends up happening is a stockroom manager might be able to keep track of inventory accuracy very thoroughly, but they really don't have a control over when inventory is received, right? So that's usually more of a procurement, purchasing department responsibility. So one way to improve your inventory balances is to address the procurement side of it. One possible option there is if you can look at VMI programs, so that's vendor managed inventory or consigned inventory, bonded inventory programs as well. All of those things fall under a common umbrella, but the point here is that if you can work with your suppliers to get faster delivery just-in-time inventory programs set up, then that can be a huge benefit in lowering your inventory value. And that's something that I'm sure if you go to your suppliers, then they'll be able to talk to you about what options they have there. The other thing to consider here is regularly updating the value of your inventory and identifying obsolete parts. What you don't want to have happen is that your inventory numbers inflate year after year because you're not going back and reviewing which parts are no longer worth keeping in your inventory, right? So we see this sometimes where people are maintaining several $1 million worth of inventory, but when you really get into it, most of those parts haven't been used in several months, if not years, and they've just been sitting there. So you want to make sure that what you have sitting in raw material or WIP or finished goods is stuff that's actually sellable for relatively active inventory, so that you know what the actual balance is. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is inventory movement. With inventory movement, we're basically measuring the velocity of that inventory through your production facility, right? It's a measure of how quickly that stuff moves, or capital conversion is another way to refer to it. It helps to divide this into segments rather than looking at all the inventory. So if you can measure inventory movement in segments like by customer or by part class or by warehouse, that can really help give you a lot of insights as well. So this is a high level description of the metrics, but be thinking about how you can segment these metrics as well. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So for inventory turns, if that's not a term that you're familiar with, an inventory turn is basically its cost of goods sold divided by average inventory value. That's the definition that I'm using here, cost of goods sold being the value of the materials that go into an assembly. There is another definition of that, which is to say cost of goods sold could be labor as well as material, as well as allocated overhead and things like that. The reason I prefer to use the material only is because that's a more, it's a better correlated measure to the inventory value, especially in contract manufacturing where you're not where you're not building the same product day in, day out, month after month. And instead, in one product, you could have 90% of the cost coming from materials, and in another product, it could be only 20% of the cost coming from materials. So it helps to be able to compare apples to apples. And the way you do that is to consider the cost of goods sold, focusing on the material side of it rather than the materials, labor, and overhead. The second metric here is inventory aging. And again, there's a few different definitions of how that plays out. The one that I'm using here, and this is how I'm interpreting inventory aging, is to say if the part is not on any active sales order or work order, then what you want to measure is the days since last used. So if it already belongs on an assembly that's going to be coming up in a few weeks, then that's not an inventory aging candidate because it's going to be used. Instead, what I like to say is if it's not on any work order, it's not on any sales order, then let's look at the last date it was used and measure the number of days since then. And if you can pull an average on that, if you can come up with a ratio for that compared to the value of that inventory, that'll give you some really good insight into how old your inventory actually is. The second part of that is the unused inventory. So you want to know the number and value of that inventory that's aging. So you want to know not only how old is it, but how much of it is there. And then the final part is line shortages, which most of you are probably very familiar with, but basically that means unexpected outages of components. Now let's look at how this gets tracked. This is a little bit more of a sophisticated tracking process. So I would guess it would be very hard to do this if you're only using an Access database or a spreadsheet or something. But basically what you want to be able to have is your data source should be able to maintain an accurate cost of goods sold balance. And the way you do that is you'd be able to allocate inventory directly to work orders and shipments. If you aren't able to do that accurately, so for example, if you have a disconnect between your shipments and your kitting activity, for example, then it's very hard to keep these metrics. So that's the first thing. The second thing here is that you want to be able to associate costs with your inventory, just like always, and keeping the historical record. And then the fourth point here is being able to track line shortages versus planned purchase orders. So if you're using an MRP or if you're using an ERP system and you've got automatic ordering and things like that, you want to be able to make sure that you've got a different transaction type for orders that were placed because of a production outage or a line shortage versus a planned purchase order that was part of normal business. And then the next point here is, and I'll combine the next two, is to be able to identify inactive bills of material and being able to identify obsolete inventory. So you want to have some kind of flag or some kind of warehouse or something that lets you know that these BOMs are inactive and therefore all of the components inside of it are no longer being used. And then for the inventory part of it, you can separate it into a logical warehouse or put some kind of flag on it or some kind of new part classification to say that this is actual obsolete inventory. In terms of impacted areas, the areas impacted here are financial reporting, liquidity, working capital ratios, just like before. The inventory write-off risk is also much higher. So this is a little bit different than the bad debt risk. This is to say that the inventory over time will become less useful to you. So you want to make sure that you're managing these metrics because the more they age, the more unused inventory you have, the more liability you're accruing. The next thing I'll say on this is also on-time delivery gets impacted here. The faster you try to turn inventory, the counterbalancing metric there is on-time delivery a lot of times. So if you're pulling an inventory just as you need it, just barely getting it under the wire, then there's a possibility that out of the 100 components on the bill of material, even if one of them ends up coming in a little late, then your entire order is going to end up being late. And then shipping cost and purchase price, I'll combine those two a little bit to say that that's basically going to affect your purchasing. So if you end up having more line shortages or you have a very strict policy of being able to keep inventory on hand, then what ends up happening is you might end up paying a higher price when you need it in a rush, or you might end up paying UPS overnight shipping costs or something like that in order to get the part there in time. And then finally, production and scalability, production flexibility and scalability. So that means, can I adjust the schedule based on feedback from my customer or based on changes in production, production planning, or am I bound to the plan I've created and might end up with more downtime because I don't actually have the inventory coming in until exactly the time that I had originally planned it to be there. In terms of how you can improve this, so the first part of it is still kind of the same. So you can improve your procurement, you can improve your inventory programs and set some of those up with your suppliers. And then the third point is what I want to emphasize here is that one of the things that we do see sometimes is that you set up inventory holding policies with customers. So if a customer comes to you relatively new, you might say, hey, you're asking me to build $1 million worth of assemblies, but in order for me to assume that risk of carrying all that inventory over the next year, we need some kind of down payment on just the material cost or something. That can be really helpful to your cash flow, and it can also be really helpful to offset any risk of bad debt or something that could come out of that. Next, we're talking about inventory profitability. And with inventory profitability, we're basically measuring costs. So the three things that I've got here are gross margin, carrying costs, and price variance, which means purchase price variance. So for gross margin, the way that that formula works out is it's revenue minus cost of goods sold divided by revenue. So think of it as if I had $1 million in revenue and my inventory value was 600,000, then it would be 1 million minus 600,000 divided by 1 million. So that's gross margin, and what that tells you is basically it's going to be a percentage showing you the profitability. By itself, not a great measure, but combined with other things, it can be very powerful. The reason that it's not a great measure by itself is the example that I gave before about on one order, you might have 90% gross margin using that calculation. On another one, you might only have 10% gross margin. And that's determined largely based on the complexity of the build, the contract that you're winning, the volume, the turn time, things like that. Carrying cost is also part of profitability here. Carrying cost can be calculated in a variety of different ways, but and that can include the space for your inventory. So how much space is allocated to your stock room, and you could allocate some of the overhead for your rent there, or the time to dekit and kit jobs. So that's telling you how much time you're spending looking for parts. And then any kind of inventory tools or systems you've put in place, all of those things fall into carrying cost of inventory along with the capital also, right? So for example, if you have to take a line of credit to keep inventory, then that's part of it as well. While you could come up with all kinds of complex ways of measuring that carrying cost, the three things that I like to use that I see are probably the most effective are FTE, full-time employees that need to be used to maintain that inventory. The second one is the amount of inventory write-offs that are happening over a period of time. And then the third one is the cost of capital. So if you have any kind of interest expense coming from working capital loans or something like that, then that would be the third part of it. And then the final point here is the purchase price variance. So that's basically measuring what is the cost of purchasing something compared to an established standard. So that could be a standard cost tool, or it could be a weighted historical price. It could be comparing it to a quote that you've recently done. There's a variety of measures there, but the point is, how do you compare to the price that you were expecting to pay for that? Also insightful there is if you can slice that and dice that into different ways. So for example, you could slice it by customer, you could slice it by supplier, you could slice it by type of order. So is it a production build versus a prototype build? Or you could even do it by buyer. So you could say, okay, comparing one person to another, are we getting a positive variance in one place? If so, let's apply those best practices across the team. In terms of what your data source should be able to do, so the first point there, maintaining an accurate cost of goods sold balance, we talked about that already, and associating cost to inventory and keeping historical record. The last point here is what's kind of new is if you can have a system that keeps some kind of standard or target cost to compare purchasing against, then that would be a really powerful thing in order to be able to track these metrics. Now, one thing I'll say here is that, especially for contract manufacturing, most of you are probably aware that it the price will fluctuate, right? So you can't just have one standard cost or one target cost for a component, because if you're buying one of that component, then it's going to be a very different price than if you're buying 100 versus if you're buying 1,000. And so if you have the option to do so, then what I would suggest is putting in some kind of logic to say that the target price that I'm establishing is for this range of volume or something like that, so that you're actually comparing against something that's more specific to the purchase that you're going to make. Okay, the final the final thing I want to say on this one is the impacted areas, and again, the profitability on the financial reporting, the purchase price, which is the overall spend on materials, and the production flexibility and scalability are going to be impacted. One thing I'll say is that there's a lot of balancing that happens here, because as you try to lower one, so for example, if you try to lower the purchase price variance, then what could happen is that you start to have impact on the production scheduling, because you're basically asking for a lower price, but that means that inventory might not necessarily be available all the time. And you might start to see higher minimum order quantities, which means that you've got more inventory building up. So it's very important to consider this in relation to those other areas as well. And the way to improve this area is, one thing I would say is you can organize the warehouse and increase adherence to processes. And what that's going to impact is the amount of time spent looking for inventory, kitting jobs, things like that. So if you can come up with, applying principles of 5S, Lean, Six Sigma, however you choose to do that, but and there's a lot of different programs and methodologies out there. But the point here is that if you can come up with a way to have a more efficiently organized warehouse, easier to find inventory, then that's going to lower your carrying cost pretty substantially. The second thing here is that if you can establish some kind of inventory program with your suppliers, that'll also help reduce the carrying cost, because you're going to have less inventory on hand. And then establishing inventory holding policies with customers, like we already talked about. The final point here is that if you can somehow resell or repurpose inventory, that can also be very powerful. So there's a lot of companies out there who will take a list of parts from you and say, okay, you've got these in an obsolete warehouse. If we find a buyer, then we'll take a cut and we'll sell it on your behalf. That can be a really powerful way to make use of inventory that you thought was unprofitable and instead list it on the market to be able to resell it. So we're approaching the end here. In conclusion, I want to say a couple things. One is that metrics tracking, I mentioned this in the beginning, it starts with strategy, but really you can't just look at it as a math problem. It is a strategy, people, process, and technology problem. So you want to make sure that you're addressing all elements of this in order to create the proper metric that you want to track, as well as being able to actually track it and implement it. The other thing I'll say is that what I covered here today is meant as an introduction. We'd love to talk to you more about it, get your ideas on it, and turn this into a conversation. So just by attending today, feel free to schedule some time. You'll get an email shortly after this webinar if you'd like to schedule a 30-minute consultation with us, and we can talk to you in a little bit more detail about metrics tracking. And then finally, let us know if there's any other areas that you'd like to cover. So if in addition to inventory tracking, you'd like us to talk about anything else, feel free to send that feedback to us as well. You can just reply to the emails that you've already gotten. And with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Let me see if any questions have come in. In case you're wondering, there is a way to be able to ask questions. I think it should be, I think it's like a question and answer. It says Q&A on your screen. We'll give it a second. Otherwise, thank you all for joining, and everybody have a good day.